Working at the chemical plant has always been a challenge, but I, Alyssa Carter, have always enjoyed my role. Being an exemplary employee brought me recognition and a certain degree of respect among my colleagues. However, everything started to change when I started noticing a series of security flaws in my work section. At first, I thought these were isolated incidents. Little leaks here and there, equipment that seemed to wear out faster than normal. But as time passed, the frequency of these failures increased, and their severity intensified. I then decided to pay more attention and document each occurrence. "Mark, have you noticed how security sensors are failing more often?" I asked my best friend and colleague, Mark, during a break. "Yes, Alyssa, but I thought it was just a coincidence." "I guess I'm so used to it that I didn't even realize how serious it could be," he replied, frowning. From that moment on, I began to record everything meticulously. Every flaw, every anomaly, every little detail that could be relevant. Before long, my records became a robust dossier, filled with evidence that these oversights could cause a catastrophic disaster. I couldn't sit idly by. I decided it was time to confront my boss, Donald Harris. I walked into his office with a stack of documents in hand, determined to be heard. "Donald, we need to talk. There are serious security breaches happening at the factory, and they are becoming more frequent. This could lead to a disaster if we don't do something immediately," I said, placing the documents on his desk. Donald looked up from his computer screen and looked at me with a disdainful expression. "Alyssa, you're exaggerating. Small problems are common in any operation. Now, get back to work and let me take care of it." "But Donald, these aren't small glitches. I'm talking about chemical leaks, safety sensors that don't work properly, and equipment that's beyond the point of repair. These can put lives at risk." I insisted, feeling my frustration rising. He sighed, visibly impatient. "Look, Alyssa, I appreciate your dedication, but we don't have the budget to fix all of this right now. We'll deal with problems as they arise. Now, please get back to work." I left Donald's office feeling discouraged and helpless. How could he be so indifferent to the evidence? It was clear he was more concerned about costs than employee safety. I decided I couldn't give up. People like Mark, my team, every worker at the factory deserved a safe environment. I returned to my workstation, but my mind was racing. I grabbed my cell phone and texted Mark, "We need to talk. Meet me in the break room after shift." When we met, I showed him all my notes and records. "This is serious, Mark. If we don't do something, disaster could happen." He looked at the documents, visibly worried. "I know you're right, Alyssa, but what can we do? My wife is pregnant, I can't afford to lose this job." "I understand, Mark. But think about what could happen if we don't act. We need to find a way to resolve this without putting our jobs at risk," I said, trying to remain calm. Mark took a deep breath and nodded. "Okay, I'll help you. But we have to be very careful." From that moment on, we began to investigate further, going through old files, talking discreetly with other colleagues and collecting more evidence. Each new discovery only reinforced the gravity of the situation. We were dealing with something much bigger than we imagined. This was just the tip of the iceberg, and I knew I had to keep going, no matter how difficult or dangerous it was. The safety of everyone in the factory depended on it. And I, Alyssa Carter, would not give up so easily. After a frustrating meeting with Donald Harris, where he completely dismissed my concerns, I found myself without many options. I needed to share my findings with someone I trusted, someone who could give me a different perspective. It was then that I decided to reach out to my best friend and coworker, Mark. "Mark, I need to talk to you." "I'm serious," I said, my voice thick with concern, as we met in the factory cafeteria during our break. He looked at me with a worried expression. "What happened, Alyssa?" I began explaining all the security flaws I had discovered and documented. I talked about the catastrophic risk these oversights posed and how Donald Harris simply ignored my concerns. Mark frowned, clearly disturbed by what he was hearing. "This is really serious, Alyssa. But, What do you expect me to do? My wife is pregnant, I can't risk losing my job right now. I understood his dilemma. Mark was in a delicate situation, and I didn't want to put him at risk. But at the same time, I knew I needed his help. I know, Mark. I don't want to put you in a difficult position. But I really need someone to trust. Someone who can help me investigate further. He sighed deeply, clearly torn between loyalty to the friendship and fear of the consequences. Let's do this. I'll help you, but we need to be extremely careful. We can't leave any traces. From that moment on, we started working together in secret. We spent hours after work sifting through documents, analyzing security reports, and chatting discreetly with other colleagues. Each new discovery only deepened my conviction that we were dealing with something much bigger than simple negligence. One night, while we were in the files room, Mark found a report that appeared to have been deliberately hidden at the bottom of a drawer. "Look at this, Alyssa," he said, handing me the document. As I read it, my heart raced. It was a list of security incidents, many of which had never been officially reported. "This is a bombshell, Mark. If this comes to light, the factory could be shut down." He nodded, tension visible on his face. "We need to be careful. If anyone finds out we're messing with these files, we could be in serious trouble." Despite the fear, we continued our investigation. The friendship with Mark was put to the test several times during this period. There were times when he wanted to give up, worried about his family, but I always managed to convince him to continue. "We're doing this not just for ourselves, but for everyone here," I said. "If we don't act, a disaster could happen." Our teamwork began to bear fruit. We discovered a network of corruption that involved not only Donald Harris, but also other members of the senior administration. The situation was much more complex and dangerous than I had initially imagined. At a particularly tense moment, Mark pulled me into a corner of the hallway. "Alyssa, I don't know if we can go through with this. I'm really scared. What if they find out? What if something happens to my wife and my future child?" I put my hand on his shoulder, trying to offer some comfort. "I understand your fear, Mark. And I appreciate everything you're doing. But we need to move forward. We're so close. We can't let these corrupt people continue to put lives at risk." He took a deep breath, clearly fighting his own inner demons, but finally nodded. "Okay, let's continue. But we need to get someone else involved. Someone who can help us deal with this in a safer way." It was then that we decided to seek help from my former mentor, Dr. Helen Foster. We knew that with her experience and knowledge, she would be a valuable ally. And so, with our friendship renewed and strengthened by our common cause, we moved forward, determined to expose the truth and prevent imminent disaster. I was sitting at my desk, surrounded by stacks of documents and reports, when I had a snap. The situation at the factory was becoming untenable and I knew I needed help. It was then that I remembered Dr. Helen Foster, my former mentor. Helen had taught me everything I knew about chemical safety and emergency procedures, and I knew that if anyone could help me understand the severity of the flaws I was discovering, it was her. I decided to look for her, even though I knew that she had retired after a series of disagreements with the company's management. Helen had always been strict and ethical, and I suspected she had faced similar problems to me before she was forced to leave. I picked up the phone and dialed his number. "Hello," Helen's voice sounded on the other end of the line, a little hoarse, but unmistakable. "Helen, it's me, Alyssa Carter. I need to talk to you. It's urgent." "Alyssa. How long? What's going on?" She looked surprised, but also worried. "It's complicated, Helen. I'm discovering a series of security breaches at the factory and my boss, Donald Harris, is ignoring everything. I think there's something very wrong going on. Can we meet?" Helen hesitated for a moment, but then agreed. "Sure, Alyssa. Come over to my house tonight. We need to talk." When I arrived at Helen's house, I was greeted with a warm hug. She led me into the living room and offered me tea. We sat down and I began to report everything I had found. She listened attentively, without interrupting, but I saw the concern in her eyes. "This is very serious, Alyssa," she said finally. "These failures could cause a disaster of immense proportions. We need to act quickly." "I know, Helen. But I don't know what to do. Donald is ignoring everything and I'm scared something terrible will happen." Helen sighed and took a sip of tea before answering. "When I was at the factory, I also encountered similar problems. I tried to alert management, but I was silenced and eventually forced to retire. It seems the situation has only gotten worse since then." "So, are you going to help me?" I asked, hopefully. Helen smiled and placed her hand over mine. "Of course I will. Let's start by reviewing all the data you've collected. We need to gather as much evidence as possible." We spent hours analyzing the documents, discussing every detail. Helen provided me with valuable insights into safety procedures and how to identify patterns of negligence. She also suggested ways to document failures in a way that would be difficult for the board to ignore. "We need to be meticulous, Alyssa. Any mistake can be used against us. And we need to think of a strategy to expose this in the most effective way possible," said Helen, while making notes in a notebook. As we worked, I felt a weight being lifted off my shoulders. I was no longer alone in this fight. Helen not only brought with her a wealth of experience, but also a fierce determination to do the right thing. "Do you think we should involve the press?" I asked. Helen pondered for a moment. "Not yet. First, we need irrefutable evidence. Then, we can consider this option. But we must be prepared for any retaliation." That night was the beginning of a new phase in my battle against negligence and corruption at the factory. With Helen by my side, I felt we had a real chance to make a difference. I left her home exhausted, but full of hope and renewed determination. I knew the road ahead would be difficult, but I was ready to face any challenge that came my way. Collaborating with Helen not only provided me with the technical and emotional support I needed, but also reinforced my commitment to fighting for the safety of everyone at the factory. And so, with the help of my former mentor, we continued our investigation, more determined than ever to expose the truth and prevent imminent disaster. The tension increased every day. After weeks of investigating safety lapses at the chemical plant, I, Alyssa Carter, was beginning to feel the weight of the danger we were in. It all started with small incidents, but they soon became real and palpable threats. It was clear that someone was trying to intimidate us and silence our findings. One night, as I was leaving the factory, I realized that my car had been vandalized. The tires were flat and the hood had been scratched with threatening words. "Give up, Alyssa," the message etched into the metal read. I felt a chill down my spine and immediately called Mark. "Mark, we need to talk. My car was vandalized." My voice shook as I spoke. "Vandalized?" Mark replied, alarmed. "What did they do?" "They scratched the hood and punctured the tires. They left a threatening message for me." I replied, trying to remain calm. "This is getting too dangerous, Alyssa. Maybe we should stop here." Mark suggested, worried. "We can't stop now, Mark. We are so close to the truth." I insisted. "We need to continue, no matter how dangerous it is." In the days that followed, the threats only increased. I received anonymous messages on my cell phone, intimidating emails, and even a letter delivered to my door. The words were always the same: "Give up or you will pay dearly." I began to realize that I was being followed. Once, while walking home, I noticed a black car following me. I sped up and tried to lose him, but the fear was constant. I went to the house of my old mentor, Dr. Helen Foster, to seek advice. She received me with concern in her eyes. "Alyssa, are you okay?" Helen asked, hugging me. "No, Helen. I'm being threatened. They are trying to silence us," I said, feeling a lump in my throat. "You need to be careful. These people are dangerous," Helen warned, holding my hands. "But we can't give up now. We have to expose this network of corruption. I know, Helen. But I am afraid. I confessed, letting a tear escape. Fear is natural, Alyssa. But the courage is to move forward despite it. Helen said, encouraging me. Mark also began to feel the pressure. His wife was pregnant and he feared the consequences for his family. One night, he came to my house, visibly shaken. Alyssa, I don't know if I can continue. Mark said, his eyes full of concern. What if something happens to my wife and the baby? I understand your fear, Mark. I replied, trying to be understanding. But think about the lives that are at risk if we do nothing. They trust us to expose the truth. You are right. Mark sighed. I just hope we can do this without putting our families in danger. The threats kept us on constant alert. I could barely sleep, fearing what could happen at any moment. But the determination to prevent an imminent disaster and expose corruption at the chemical plant gave me the strength to continue. We decided to inform Tom Reynolds, the investigative journalist who had shown interest in our story. Tom met us at a low-key cafe where we discussed the situation. You need to be very careful, Tom said, after listening to our concerns. These people don't play around on the job. But I promise that I will do everything in my power to help you. We appreciate it, Tom. I replied, feeling a little relieved. We need all the help we can get. As the tension grew, so did our determination. We knew we were risking everything, but many people's lives depended on our actions. Every day was a new battle, but we were prepared to face any threat that came our way. The fight was just beginning, and giving up was not an option. At every step, we felt the weight of the threats, but also the strength of our cause. The truth needed to be revealed, and we were willing to face any obstacle to ensure everyone's safety. When I realized that we were at a dead end inside the factory, I decided that the only way to expose the corruption and security failures was to go to the press. Then I remembered Tom Reynolds, an investigative journalist known for his hard-hitting stories about corporate corruption. I decided to look for him, even though I knew that this decision could have serious consequences. I arranged to meet Tom at a discreet cafe in the city center. I arrived early, anxious and with a whirlwind of thoughts in my head. When he entered, I immediately recognized him by his confident bearing and inquisitive expression. He approached my table and introduced himself with a smile. Alyssa Carter, right? He said, extending his hand. That's right. Nice to meet you, Tom. I shook his hand, feeling a hint of nervousness. You mentioned something about security breaches and corruption at the factory where you work. Can you tell me more about this? He asked, taking a notepad out of his pocket. I took a deep breath and began reporting everything I had discovered, from the security flaws to Donald Harris's negligence. Tom listened attentively, taking quick, incisive notes. And do you have concrete proof of these accusations? He asked, looking me in the eyes. Yes, I have. I documented each failure, took photos and even obtained some compromising emails. I replied, handing him a folder full of documents. Tom leafed through the folder, analyzing each page carefully. After a few minutes, he closed the folder and looked at me with a serious expression. Alyssa, this is a huge story. But you understand that by getting involved, I'm also putting myself at risk, right? He said, with a hint of concern in his voice. I understand, Tom. But we need to expose this before something terrible happens. I replied, determined. Tom agreed to investigate further, but he also had his concerns. We met several times over the following weeks. During one of these meetings, he expressed his doubts. Alyssa, do you trust everyone around you? He asked, with a cautious tone. I trust Mark and Dr. Helen Foster. They have been helping me since the beginning. I replied, although his question made me uneasy. What about Donald Harris? Does he have any idea what we're doing? He insisted. I am not sure. But he knows I'm investigating. I admitted, feeling a chill down my spine. It was then that Tom revealed something that alarmed me. I received an anonymous message yesterday, saying that I'm getting into things where I shouldn't be," he said, with a worried expression. "Do you think it's Donald?" I asked, feeling a wave of panic. Could it be? But this only reinforces the importance of continuing. Tom replied, trying to sound confident. As Tom continued his investigation, he uncovered more details about the corruption network. One night, during a phone call, he shared a shocking discovery. "Alyssa, I discovered that some of the factory contracts were signed by shell companies," he said, his voice low and urgent. "That's huge, Tom. But that also means we're dealing with dangerous people," I replied, worried about our safety. "I know it. We need to be careful," Tom agreed. A few days later, Tom called me again, his voice thick with tension. "Alyssa, we need to meet. I have something important to show you," he said. We met in an empty parking lot, and Tom showed me documents that revealed the depth of the corruption. But there was also something else in his gaze, something that made me question whether he was being completely honest with me. "Tom, can I trust you?" I asked, directly. He hesitated for a moment before responding. "Alyssa, I'm in this as much as you are. But we need to be smart," he said, avoiding my gaze. That answer didn't completely convince me, but I had no choice but to trust him, at least for now. The pressure was mounting, and time was running out. I knew that with Tom by my side, I had a chance to expose the truth. But he also knew he was entering a dangerous game, where every move could be his last. During the investigation, I, Alyssa Carter, came across a disturbing truth. Laura Benson, one of our company's directors, was aware of the security breaches. To my dismay, she chose to ignore them in exchange for financial benefits. The gravity of the situation required a direct and frank conversation, and I knew I needed to confront her. That afternoon, when I walked into Laura's office, the tension in the air was palpable. She was sitting at her desk, her eyes fixed on documents she clearly wasn't reading. When he saw me, he closed the folder and took a deep breath. "Alyssa, what are you doing here?" she asked, trying to sound confident, but I could see the uncertainty in her eyes. "We need to talk, Laura." "And it's not going to be an easy conversation," I said, sitting across from her desk and looking straight into her eyes. "I know you are aware of the security breaches at the factory and that you are covering it up for money." She looked away, visibly uncomfortable. "Alyssa, you don't understand the pressure I'm under. There's a lot more at stake here than you realize. More at stake than the safety of hundreds of workers in the surrounding community," I retorted, keeping my voice steady. "You are putting lives at risk, and why? For some financial benefits?" Laura sighed, running a hand through her hair. "It's not that simple. The company is experiencing financial difficulties, and if these flaws are exposed, we could suffer a total collapse. Many people will lose their jobs. But if a disaster happens, how many lives will be destroyed?" I argued. "We cannot sacrifice safety for profit. You have an ethical responsibility here, Laura. We all do." She was silent for a moment, clearly struggling with her own inner demons. I took the opportunity to continue. "Laura, I'm not here to judge you. I know you're in a difficult position, but we have to do what's right. Think about what's at stake. If this situation gets out of control, can you live with that guilt?" She finally looked at me, her eyes filled with doubt and fear. I don't know what to do, Alyssa. I feel like I'm trapped." "You're not alone," I said softly, trying to convey some hope. "I have people helping me, Mark, Dr. Helen Foster, and now we need you. Join us. Help us solve this before it's too late." Laura hesitated, then spoke almost in a whisper. "What if I lose everything? What if the company falls apart because of this?" "Then at least we'll know we did the right thing," I replied. "And maybe, just maybe, we can save the company and everyone who depends on it at the same time." She nodded slowly, as if she was finally accepting the gravity of the situation. "Okay, Alyssa. I'll help. But we need to be careful. Donald Harris won't take this easily. I know, I agreed. But together, we have a chance. Let's expose the truth and right these wrongs. Laura stood up and held out her hand. I squeezed her firmly, feeling a new alliance forming. We're going to save this company and protect everyone who depends on it, I said, and for the first time, I saw a spark of determination in Laura's eyes. I left Laura's office feeling a mixture of relief and apprehension. The battle was just beginning, but now I had another crucial ally. I knew the next steps would be even more dangerous, but with Laura by my side, the hope of exposing corruption and avoiding disaster seemed more tangible than ever. When I realized the gravity of the situation, my heart sank. The security flaw I had discovered wasn't just a theoretical threat, we were about to face a chemical disaster of catastrophic proportions. The lives of thousands of people were at risk, and time was quickly running out. That night I met with Mark and Helen at my house. Everyone's expression was one of concern, but also of determination. Helen opened a detailed map of the factory on the dining room table. We need to act now, she said, pointing to the most critical area. If the containment system fails, chemicals will leak into the river in a matter of hours. Mark, who was normally calmer, was visibly nervous. He looked at me with wide eyes. Alyssa, are you sure we want to do this? What if something goes wrong? I took a deep breath. I knew we had no choice. Mark, if we don't act, what could go wrong is that the entire city will be contaminated, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. We need to execute the plan now, before it's too late. Helen continued to explain what we needed to do. It was a risky plan, but the only viable option. We decided that we would enter the factory at night, when security would be looser. Helen and I would focus on neutralizing the chemical threat, while Mark would keep watch and alert us to any suspicious movement. When we infiltrated the factory, the silence was deafening. Every step we took seemed to echo in the empty hallways. Helen led the way, with an impressive knowledge of the facilities, while I carried a briefcase with the equipment needed to neutralize the threat. Suddenly I heard a strange noise. It looked like someone else was in the factory. Helen and I looked at each other, fear written all over our faces. Let's go quickly, I whispered. We have to finish before they discover us. As we worked to shut down faulty systems and activate emergency protocols manually, Mark came running up. Alyssa, Helen, someone is coming. He warned, panting. We need to hurry. I felt the adrenaline rising. We knew that traitors within the company, likely allies of Donald Harris, were trying to thwart our efforts. Speed and precision were crucial at that moment. Helen, with her experienced hands, completed the last step of the procedure. Ready! She exclaimed, but without losing her urgent tone. This should hold the system long enough for us to evacuate. However, as we prepared to leave, we were surrounded by some company security guards. Mark, eyes wide, looked to me for guidance. What will we do now? He asked, panic evident in his voice. I thought quickly. I knew that trying to fight them would be futile. We needed to buy time. Mark, Helen, stay behind me, I ordered. I'll try to negotiate. I looked at the security guards, trying to look more confident than I felt. We are here to avoid a disaster, I declared. If you don't let us finish, you will be in danger too. One of them hesitated, but another, clearly more loyal to Donald, stepped forward. Orders are orders, he said coldly. You are coming with us. At that moment, we heard an alarm go off. It was a sign that the containment system was stabilizing. I took advantage of the distraction and signaled Helen and Mark to run. We managed to escape through a side corridor while the security guards were disoriented by the alarm. Finally, we left the factory, breathless but relieved. We had managed to neutralize the threat, at least temporarily. We achieved, said Helen, with a tired smile. Yes, but now we need to expose all of this, I replied. The fight is not over yet. We knew the next step was vital, getting all the evidence to the press and authorities. We were exhausted, but the race against time had given us new hope. I was exhausted and stressed, but determined to move forward with our plan to prevent the impending disaster. Helen, Mark and I had spent sleepless nights working out every detail of the operation. Adrenaline coursed through my veins as we prepared for action. Everything seemed to be going according to plan, until I discovered a devastating truth. Tom Reynolds, the journalist I trusted so much, was working with Donald Harris. It was Helen who brought the news. She found an email on Tom's laptop that clearly indicated he was providing information about our movements to Donald. I felt betrayed and angry. How could he do this? "Alyssa, we need to talk," Helen said, pulling me to a more private corner of the room. "What is it, Helen?" "We're up against the deadline," I replied, impatiently. Helen handed me Tom's laptop, open to the incriminating email screen. My heart sank. "It can't be," I whispered, running my hand over my face. I decided I needed to confront Tom immediately. He was in the next room, reviewing some notes. I walked over to him, feeling a mix of anger and disappointment. "Tom, we need to talk," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. He looked at me, surprised. "Of course, Alyssa." "What there was?" he asked, with an expression that seemed genuinely confused. I showed him the email. "What is this, Tom? Are you working with Donald? Are you betraying us?" My voice rose a tone, reflecting the emotion I was trying to control. Tom sighed deeply, running a hand through his hair. "Alyssa, I can explain," he started, but I interrupted him. "You better explain," I said, crossing my arms. "Donald blackmailed me," he finally revealed. "He said that if I didn't cooperate, he would destroy my career and ruin my personal life." I had no choice. I wanted to believe him, but the pain of betrayal was deep. "And you thought that betraying the trust of all of us was the best solution?" I asked, feeling tears pooling in my eyes. Tom hung his head, embarrassed. I did not know what to do. I was stuck between a rock and a hard place. "But I swear, Alyssa, I never meant to harm you." I took a deep breath, trying to process everything. My mind was racing, but I knew I didn't have time to get down. "I can't trust you anymore, Tom. If you want to redeem yourself, get out of our way and don't interfere anymore. We'll carry on without you," I declared, my voice firmer than I felt inside. He nodded, looking defeated. "I understand. Good luck, Alyssa. I hope you can stop Donald and save everyone." I returned to the room where Helen and Mark were waiting. "And then?" Mark asked, anxiously. "Tom is out," I replied, bluntly. "He was being blackmailed by Donald, but now we need to move on without him. We have to be even more careful, and distrust will be our greatest ally." Helen nodded. "I agree, Alyssa. Let's review the plan one more time and make sure we have everything under control." We spent the next few hours fine-tuning the final details of the operation. The tension in the air was palpable, but we were more determined than ever. We knew that one mistake could cost lives. As we prepared for action, my mind wandered between Tom's betrayal and the responsibility that weighed on my shoulders. It couldn't fail. There was a lot at stake. That night, when we finally put the plan into practice, every step was taken with extreme caution. I led the group, feeling the weight of responsibility in every movement. Despite Tom's betrayal, I found strength in Helen and Mark. Together, we formed a resilient and relentless team. We were more united than ever, determined to expose the truth and prevent the impending disaster. The journey was far from over, but I knew that with the truth on our side, we had a real chance of winning. And, above all, she was willing to fight to the end for everyone's safety and the justice we deserved. When we finally gathered all the evidence needed to expose the corruption and prevent the impending disaster, we knew we were approaching the decisive moment, the final confrontation with Donald Harris and the others involved. It was a Friday afternoon, and the atmosphere in the room was charged with tension. Laura Benson, who had finally decided to do the right thing, was at my side, as were Mark and Helen. "We have everything we need," said Helen, organizing the documents meticulously into a folder. Now it's just a question of how we approach it. Donald will try to escape, I said, remembering all the times he had shied away from responsibilities. We have to be prepared for anything. Laura looked at me, her eyes reflecting a mix of fear and determination. I can provide inside information that could be crucial. I know where he keeps copies of the fraudulent contracts and payment records. That's great, Laura, Mark said, trying to sound encouraging. But are you sure you're ready for this? There's no going back after today. Laura nodded, although a little hesitantly. I'm ready. The time has come to right my wrongs. With a plan in mind, we headed to Donald's office. The environment was too silent, like the calm before a storm. Donald, we need to talk, I said, trying to keep my voice steady as we entered his office without knocking. He looked up from the papers on his desk, an expression of surprise followed by a mask of indifference. Alyssa, this is highly irregular. What do you think you are doing? We know everything, Donald, I said, holding the evidence folder in my hand. And we have the evidence to prove it. You're making a big mistake, he said, slowly standing up. You don't know who you're dealing with. Actually, we know exactly who we're dealing with, Helen interjected, her eyes fixed on Donald. And we're past the intimidation phase. You have nothing against me, Donald said, but there was a note of desperation in his voice. Laura stepped forward, handing Mark a flash drive. Here are the internal files, Donald. It's about time someone showed the truth. Donald tried to grab the flash drive, but Mark was faster, holding it tightly. Not so fast. It was then that everything happened very quickly. Donald made a sudden move to the desk drawer, and before we could react, he pulled out a revolver. Don't do anything stupid, he said, pointing the gun at us. None of you will get out of here alive if you don't give me this proof. This isn't going to get you anywhere, Donald, I said, trying to stay calm. The evidence has already been sent to the press and authorities. It's over. He hesitated, the certainty in his expression beginning to waver. You are lying. No, we're not, Helen replied, her voice firm and assured. You lost. At that moment, we heard sirens in the distance. The police were arriving. Donald, realizing he was cornered, tried one last desperate move, but Mark managed to disarm him with one quick movement. The gun fell to the ground with a crash, and Donald was pinned down. Minutes later, police officers entered the room and arrested Donald Harris. The feeling of relief was overwhelming. Finally, the truth would be revealed, and justice would be served. Laura turned to me, tears in her eyes. Thank you, Alyssa. I couldn't have done it without you. We're a team, I replied, hugging her. And now, we can sleep easy knowing we did the right thing. As Donald was let out in handcuffs, I felt a rush of satisfaction. We had faced threats, intimidation and moral dilemmas, but in the end, the truth prevailed. And I knew that, despite everything, it had been worth it. The impactful turnaround. Tension was in the air as we prepared for the final confrontation. Mark, Helen, and Laura Benson, now our ally, and I had gathered enough evidence to expose the corruption and prevent the impending disaster. We knew Donald Harris wouldn't go down without a fight, and the risk was higher than ever. Are you sure we're ready for this, Alyssa? Mark asked, clearly nervous but determined. Yes, Mark. We have all the evidence and have sent it in advance to the press and authorities. Even if something goes wrong, the truth will come out, I replied, trying to instill confidence in our group. Our plan was simple but risky. We would confront Donald and the others directly at the factory, where all the evidence was stored. Laura, with her insider knowledge, would guide us to the exact location where Donald kept the compromising documents. As we entered the factory, the silence was deafening. Each step echoed through the empty hallways, increasing the tension. Finally, we reached the control room where Donald and his accomplices were gathered. The look of surprise and anger on Donald's face was palpable. What do you think you're doing here? He shouted, voice full of venom. We're here to put an end to the charade, Donald. We have all the evidence we need to expose your security failures and corruption, I declared, keeping my voice steady. Donald laughed, a cold, humorless sound. You think you can just come in here and take me down? I have more power than you can imagine. Before we could react, we heard a screeching sound and suddenly an explosion rocked the factory. The room was filled with smoke and debris, and confusion ensued. Amidst the chaos, I could see Donald trying to escape, a panicked expression on his face. There he goes. We can't let him get away. I shouted, as we ran after him. Donald ran through the factory corridors, but we were determined not to let him escape. Finally, we managed to catch up with him near the emergency exit. Mark knocked him to the ground, pinning him. You're not getting away this time, Donald, Mark said, panting. Donald looked at me, his face a mix of anger and despair. You get nothing out of this, Alyssa. You'll end up like me, discarded by the system. I'd rather be discarded than live knowing I could have done something and didn't, I replied, feeling the adrenaline rush through my veins. Shortly after, the sounds of sirens began to echo outside. Police and firefighters arrived quickly, and Donald was taken into custody. The factory was on fire, but authorities managed to control the fire before it spread. In the following days, the story spread like wildfire in the press. The evidence we submitted was released, and Donald's corruption network was exposed. He and his accomplices were arrested, and the factory underwent a complete overhaul of its security systems. I received countless compliments and even invitations to speak about the importance of ethics and safety at work. Mark, for his loyalty and courage, was offered a new, better job at a competing company where he could work without fear of reprisal. Helen, my mentor, was invited to return as a security consultant, a well-deserved recognition of her experience and integrity. In a public ceremony, I was recognized as a hero. I felt a mixture of relief and pride, knowing that my fight was not in vain. Revenge was sweet, but more importantly, justice was served. The factory, now with a completely redesigned security system, has become an example of how integrity and courage can make a difference. As I looked to the future, I knew there was still a lot of work to be done. But now, with true allies by my side and a safer system for everyone, I was ready to face any challenge that came my way.